even if there is that hard session, or even if it is not a super sunny day and it's miserable outside and you've still got to get outdoors. Yeah, it's an accountability thing, and knowing that actually there's a micro to everything, it's like that every session does count regardless of what it is.
Welcome along to the Lifting in Life podcast. I'm Cam, I'm the host. I have a bachelor's degree in psychology. I'm a personal trainer and I also work in IT. Today, I'm joined by Matt Kerr, who is a professional Ironman athlete from NZ. And in 2021, he was also the Ironman age group World Champ. As you can imagine, we delve into a whole bunch of different topics in this episode, starting off with Matt's training and nutrition. Then we also explore how he overcomes challenges and what mental toughness has looked like in his journey. As well as that, I also ask him how to build cardiovascular fitness, which might be more applicable to those of us who aren't professional Iron men or Iron women, which is probably most of us. And then also I asked him what it takes to improve at his level, because it's kind of obvious, when you're just starting out what you need to do to improve, but what a professional Ironman does to improve as well. So I personally found that quite interesting too. As always, I appreciate you tuning into the podcast, and any support you can show helps me keep getting these awesome people on. I hope you enjoy the episode, and remember, you make you.
Oh, sheesh.
But that's all right, it worked out. Anyway, we should probably get into it. Matt, it's nice to have you here today, man. Across the time zones, of course. It's nice early in the morning for you in New Zealand right now. But yeah, I appreciate you coming on here, man. I'm really intrigued to pick your brain about all things Ironman and understand sort of, I don't know, I guess how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, thanks, bud. Appreciate you having me on and reaching out. So it's awesome that we can connect. And I think, the conversations, it'll go where it goes, but also it leads to a lot of things that are also outside of triathlon. So yeah, looking forward to getting into it.
Yeah, that's spot on, man. And that's like a big focus for the podcast is like the whole idea is like using fitness as a foundation to discuss broader ideas, like all the things about the specific tools on how to get fitter and how to get stronger. That stuff's good too, but it's really enjoyable and intriguing to dig into those sort of, I don't know if I want to say philosophical, but those bigger ideas behind it, not just the superficial stuff.
And the planning, the organization, the ability to be a little bit resilient here, there, and everywhere is certainly a thing as well. So yeah, let's get into it.
Cool. Speaking of basic things, so I think we should start off basic. And but my first question for you is just to understand how you first got into Ironman. Obviously, you've been doing it for a few years now. So what was it that first got you into Ironman and pulled you into the sport?
Yes, it's a good question. I mean, relatively speaking, I guess, against a lot of the guys I'm racing, I haven't been in the sport overly long. Like, I did my first Ironman race in 2019, early 2019. So, and I was just there wasn't there as a tick box. It was there as let's see how we can go. I'd done a half Ironman sort of the December before that. But I guess really what got me into it was my coach, and still my coach to this day, sort of took me into it. And he was ex-pro. He had a couple of older bikes there, and said, "Here, have these, jump on them, and let's just see where we can go with this." So I'd come from a bit of a swimming background. I played water polo through school, so I wasn't swimming competitively, but I was swimming for fitness, for water polo. Hadn't done too much competitive running throughout my time before that, but had some experience with running. So that was kind of where that fell. I was completely new on the bike, hadn't been on the bike, so that was the big one to really learn how to actually ride a road bike and kind of develop that. But I guess luckily enough, what seems to be the harder discipline out of the three, the swimming, I had a little bit of technical aspect
Yeah, I was going to
behind
say,
that,
I feel
which
like it's probably the opposite most of the time. People are really comfortable on a bike and running, and the swimming is probably where most people is their weak point. Whereas it sounded like it was a bit of the opposite for you.
yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
yeah, certainly spent my fair share of time in the pool in my earlier days, and done some surf life saving and heavily involved in that through my time. And I guess where I was right before triathlon is I was quite deep in CrossFit.
Hmm.
And that was kind of the real early days of when CrossFit kind of was on the scene as a sport and putting its stake in the ground. So I think there was a lot of you know, CrossFit was always turn up and give it everything every session, and you just leave everything on the floor. So there was a bit
Yeah.
of sort of resilience, I think, that was created in there in the time that I was doing CrossFit. So
Mhm.
which I think has actually translated very well into the sport of where I am now of long distance triathlon.
Yeah, and what do you think your coach? What do you think his approach to it? Do you think he saw something in you that would be very suited to triathlon, or was it kind of just like a give it a crack and see how it goes?
Well, he's a scientist, so he's very much he loves the data, loves the numbers. He's obviously not racing anymore. He's in his 50s. He was a pro athlete in his day, and I think a lot of what how he trained, the implementation of what he did back then, is very different to the approach that we've taken now. And I think it was a chance for him to go. Um, he's looking at things very differently these days and more economical, and how can we train better and just
Mhm.
be all around a little bit more efficient. So I guess that was an opportunity for him to live a little bit vicariously through me
Yeah,
and kind of put things to the test. So
like a bit of a test
yeah,
dummy for him.
yeah.
And a few years on, obviously, I assume, or at least I hope, your training has probably adapted and improved since when you first did those first triathlons. When you're coming into an event, because is it 1 or 2 weeks out from Ironman NZ you are now?
Yeah, we're 1 week now, so
1 week.
very
Damn,
close.
very
Yeah.
close. So when it comes to an event like that, what does the peak of your training load look like in terms of your training and nutrition? Maybe if we started with the training aspect first, and you could give us a little bit of a breakdown into, like, I don't know, maybe the hours that you train and like how you split the load, because obviously there's swimming, biking, and running. It's not just like you're running a marathon or doing a long bike ride, you know. So could you give us an
Yeah.
insight into what your training load looks like at the peak for an event like that?
For sure. I mean, let's just talk about specifically going into an event and a race prep. That block probably looks like a 6 to 8 week period of race specificity. So we're
Mhm.
we're talking specifically workouts, sessions that are designed for that race that you've got coming up, whether it's a full distance Ironman or half distance. And I guess as we get through that time of the 6 to 8 weeks, you're really training for the training, if that makes sense. So
Mhm.
I had, if we just look at the week just gone, I had a couple of really key big sessions right at the end of this block. And I know that if I hadn't have done the work before that, I wouldn't be able to achieve those, if that
Yeah.
makes sense. So I'm kind
Yeah.
of training for the training. And once I get those key sessions done, for me, that this week was sort of Wednesday, Thursday, that kind of is going, the work's mainly done. So we're Friday now. I'm racing next Saturday, and really, there's no more fitness to be made for me. It's a
Mhm.
matter of recovering from the 6 weeks of training that I've done, and trying to really just recover from that massive accumulative fatigue that we've created over the time. Although we've had rest in between and tried to recover, there's still fatigue sitting there. So it's trying to shed a lot of that, especially in
Mhm.
this next week. But that doesn't just mean, I guess, feet up and we go into full like taper mode is what everyone kind of
Yeah.
assumed. It's basically taking out a lot of the volume. So we're not talking big hours. We've still got some intensity in there, but enough just to hit the systems and not kind of create fatigue where the body has to recover from it, if that makes sense, over
Mm.
the next week. But still tapping into those systems. I mean, um, naturally, the bike accumulates a lot more volume than the other two. just
Yeah.
because it's time on the bike. And yeah, running is like, I guess a normal week for me is between, let's go 70 and 90K
Yeah.
of running.
Mm-hmm.
The biking's a little bit more done on, I guess, on time rather than, Ks. It's not about clocking out Ks.
Yeah.
So we're sort of talking 17, 18, thereabouts on the bike.
Yeah.
And then the swim's probably in the 26 to 30K
Yeah.
a week.
And if you
So,
put those all together in terms of hours, what would that
yeah.
be?
Definitely at the front end of that training block. So probably weeks 1 to 4, you're talking 28, 29, 30, 31 hours a week.
Yeah.
And then, once it gets to this back end of the training block, it's not really about the overall volume.
Mm.
That number kind of just, it'll fall where it falls. It's about getting the key sessions done and achieving those really well, recovering from those, and then being able to back up whenever you need to with the
Mm-hmm.
following session. So it's not necessarily about creating overall volume, especially like I said at the later end.
Yeah.
It's just nailing those key sessions.
Yeah. I love what you said about the training for training's sake. I've never heard it articulated that way. And I've heard it like maybe framed in two different. Whoa, what was that? I just made balloons come up on my screen. Oh, I'm not just going to put my hands down. I don't want that to happen again. I was on to a good point there. No, what I was saying is I've never heard it articulated in a way of training for training's sake. It's maybe like training for an event. Yeah, that's obvious. Or just like focusing on that one training session. I haven't heard it put in the way of like, if I do this training session well, that's going to set me up to have a successful training session next week. Yeah.
Exactly. And like I know that those two key sessions, particularly this week, just had to be done from a confidence perspective, and
Mm,
actually, from a physiological perspective, if I can achieve those, it's good. It's what I need. But there's no way that I would be able to get those two sessions done, particularly without the build up that I'd had previously. So in order for me to do that, I need to train adequately. And let's say that
mm.
1 to 6 week block before that, in order to achieve necessarily just those two sessions.
Yeah. Would you say that it helps with quite a bit of intrinsic motivation too? Because I understand that you can get motivation from, one successful training session, but it's almost like if I have this one successful training session, then I'm also setting myself up for future success. So I feel like just sort of in the theory of it, I could see how it would help build sort of like a cumulative sort of motivation, I suppose, if you see yourself ticking those off.
Yeah, totally. And I think a lot of what we do in the sport of training here is we're talking about progression, right?
Mm,
And we're building on each session. It's not necessarily a repetitive, I go and bike for 5 hours 1 week and then go and bike the same session the next week. It's a bit, we're trying to increase over a period of time.
mm-hmm.
So it's kind of a journey that you can see throughout. And if you can get week 2 done and then week 3 done, you've done 2 and 3. Well, you're going to go one more step to week 4 to week
Yeah.
5. But as always, and as most, you always only feel as good as your last training session, which
Yeah.
is really hard as an athlete to kind of visualize as well. For those that, and I think that that's where the role of the coach comes in, is they've got that more of the holistic sort of overview, whereas an athlete
Mm-hmm.
is very self-centered and very tunnel vision on the here and the now.
Mm-hmm.
You have a bad training session, yeah, you can have some real tough times to,
Start to extrapolate it out to a bigger thing
yeah,
than what it is. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
actually it's this tiny, tiny drop in a real big pond.
Especially if you're going to be doing this for years, right? Like your session last Tuesday in 3 years.
Mm,
That was just one session, right? But I could see how you'd put a lot of weight on it, especially if you're 3 weeks out, 4 weeks out, and you feel
yeah,
like you had a shit session. I could see how that could have an impact.
100%. Yep, yep,
Mm,
it's totally a thing. And I do a bit of coaching myself. I see that with the athletes I coach. Yeah, I'm guilty of it myself as an athlete.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah.
a hard one.
Yeah, man.
Yeah,
It's always easier when you're one step removed, right? When you're not the one actually seeing it. And in terms of
yeah.
your training outside of just the three disciplines, what other physical things do you do? Maybe in terms of like strengthening work or mobility work? Are there other things that you do in that sort of training block as well?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if we're talking about like a race block before a race, it gets
Yeah.
pretty tight in terms of what you do. I mean, I do incorporate some gym stuff in there as well, but
Hmm.
it's not. We're not talking about going to the gym and doing heavy deadlifts and bench press. It's more the rehab, stability, plyometrics, kind of stuff that's just maintenance around your hip girdle and running mechanics and form and that sort of things. There's time and a place for the deadlifts and the bigger movements outside of that.
Hmm.
So yeah, definitely the strength stuff is a thing, and that's incorporated in that as well. I think what's really, what's quite good, and I've learned a lot to be a lot more have it in my training program, in times like these, is to it's not necessarily about accumulating riding on the road for, let's say, every single session. There's times where I jump on a mountain bike and I'll go
Mm.
and ride in the forest for 2 or 3 hours, and that's still training. That's still a session. It's a different kind of training. It's not specific to necessarily a race that I've got coming up, but it's still aerobic training. It's good fun. You get out there with mates, you have a good bash around, and
Mhm.
it's just a really good alternative for um, jumping on the road bike and just beating the road out again. You know what I mean? So things like
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
going for run, walk, hikes with friends, with family, and times like that. I think that there's the balance to get that balance.
Mm.
You can totally do. Obviously, you can't compromise what the key work that you need to get done. But when there's a time and a place for a little bit of easier work in the program, things like that are definitely um, things to include. And I have got better at doing that.
Yeah, I like that because it's kind of like two birds with one stone too. Like you get to hang out with your mates or with your family and also be working on your cardiovascular fitness at the same time.
100%. Yep.
Mm.
Yep.
And when it comes to your nutrition, I was thinking about it before we chatted because I've spoken to like a few endurance athletes right now, and I feel like because
Mm.
I'm so interested in how to build cardiovascular fitness, I focus so hard on the physical stuff, which I still want to pick your brain on more soon. But I thought I'd be interested to learn more about what your nutrition looks like, and maybe year round, but maybe let's keep it more specific to the training block again, so it's a bit more tangible. How strict are you with your nutrition, and what does it typically look like on a day to day for you?
Yeah. Definitely different to your most other endurance athletes, I would say.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um,
How so?
and yeah, so I guess I'm on not on, but I sort of operate on a lower carb style
Hmm.
approach, whereby it's not zero carbs and it's not keto,
Yeah.
as a lot of people refer to, but
Yep.
it's definitely on the lower carb spectrum. And I guess, yeah, delving into why. As I say, I haven't been in the sport overly long, and for me, initially, to be able to be an efficient athlete around burning the right fuel was really
Hmm.
important. I'd come from, I was eating relatively healthy, more of a sort of paleo kind of CrossFit
Yeah. Just whole foods.
approach.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess we just did a whole lot of numbers and research and lab testing, and went actually, I think, for the time that I want to be out there on an Ironman course, for the fuel that I'm burning, um, and for the time that I want to finish in, that's not going to be sustainable around using glycogen and the fuel source that I was using predominantly based out of the lab and numbers and
Hmm.
testing. So yeah, went for this kind of lower carb approach whereby we're trying to be better at burning fat essentially,
Yep.
um, because I hadn't had too much of a background in endurance sport or longer duration sport, and
Hmm.
yeah, adopted that, and it's kind of stuck, to be honest.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, if it's working, right, then it's
yeah, I mean,
working.
it worked in the early days. I went 9:20 for my first Ironman, and
Yeah.
we've just seen improvements on that. year on year from that time in. But I think for me, that's what works.
Yeah.
Doesn't have to work for everyone, or it doesn't necessarily work for everyone. As I say, it's not a no carb approach. There's sessions where I've got, VO2 work to be done, and I need fuel, I need carbohydrates, and I won't shy away from the fact of having them.
Yeah.
But I think generally, I'm definitely on a lower carb kind of approach to other
Do,
athletes.
do you know roughly what your kind of macros would be in terms of your
Um,
protein, carbs, and fats?
oh, not off the top of my head. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
probably looking, on I guess we call it a regular day. I'd be in the vicinity of 100 to 180 grams of carbs a day.
Yeah.
And that's living day by day, and then I guess it fluctuates based on what sessions I've got. Obviously,
Yeah.
if I've
Yeah.
got a
Yeah.
longer intensity session, that goes quite substantially higher than that.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's pretty. It's not, to me. It's nothing new. It's nothing different. It's not a diet. I'm not forced. I don't feel like I'm having to change things. It's just the
Mm.
way that things are for me, and I'm happy with that.
Yeah.
I can pick and choose. I know what works for me, and go out to dinner. I know what I typically would have off a menu, and I'm happy with that. It's not an
Yeah.
inconvenience really.
No, that's interesting, man. And I think it's so good to take an approach or have a mindset to figure out the best approach, right? Not just to think, I'm an endurance athlete, I have to be having 500 grams of carbs a day because that's what
Yeah,
I should be doing on paper. Like actually having the willingness to test out and try different methods to see what works best for you.
yeah, 100%. And
Mm.
some people go, "Oh, yeah, that's crazy. That doesn't work well." But yeah, I guess whatever. That's their opinion. That's cool.
Yeah.
But also, I feel I'm entitled to my own, and I hold that.
Mm.
And I know that works for me totally,
Mm.
and I've proven that to myself. And I don't need to go and prove it to other people. But it's a matter of just being confident in what you do. So yeah,
Yeah, and if you started to lose and your times got slower and slower, I'm sure you'd think, oh, I should probably increase my carbohydrates because it's not working. But if it's
yeah,
working, right, it's working. And it's like in any sport, like you chat to a bodybuilding coach and they'll say some of their clients are on higher fats and lower carbs or higher carbs and lower fats, depending on how the individual operates best.
hundred
Mm.
percent. Yep, yep. As I
And
say,
what
it's
about you go.
no, you're good. Yeah, off you go.
Oh, yeah. I was going to say, still on the tack of nutrition. What about
Yeah.
specifically for a race day? What does your race day nutrition look like? Are you typically consuming like gels or whole foods, or like what's your kind of go to when you're racing?
Yeah, so a race day is like there's intensity there. I need fuel, I need
Mm,
carbs. I know that I need carbohydrates, but ultimately there's only so much that I can get in and
mm,
the body can process and digest as fuel. And that's where that trade-off of being an efficient fat burner or having the metabolic flexibility to be able to burn fat at the intensity that I want to race at is becomes a
mhm,
thing. So all of my carbs come from liquid, essentially. And that's just an easy process for me. That's what I've found works for me in terms of trying to get fuel in. So yeah, I'll load up on carbohydrates through fluid source. Obviously, the swim's the swim, and then on the bike, it's just getting that stuff in through fluid, and
mhm.
yeah, trying to fuel as best you can for the run on the bike, if that makes sense. I
Yeah.
think if you're trying to fuel for the run on the run, you've probably left it a little bit too late.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so probably like I guess if we break that down into an hour type thing,
Mm.
it's around the 50 to 60 grams of carbs per hour on the
Yeah.
bike.
Yeah. And you find that like consuming most of it through liquid obviously sits well with your gut and all that kind of stuff. Like you can process it easy enough.
Yeah, yeah, it does, and I think that's what you got to test in training, right? And that's what
Yeah.
training is for. Training is for practice. It's practicing those things.
Hmm.
So when you come to race day, you know that what you've practiced in training is not going to be a risk, and that's
Yeah.
something that you can eliminate out of the race day risks of things that could go wrong. It's like I've tested it, I know it works, and I'm going to implement it on race day.
Yeah, one less variable that you have to manage come race day. You
100%.
mentioned about in terms of having a poor or bad training session and how it can sort of have a psychological impact on you. And towards the end of last year, because I've been following you for a little while, I saw that you had an intercostal injury, which
Mm.
obviously affected your ability to train. How did you find that impacted you psychologically, given that, especially if one training session could throw you off a little bit? How did you find that process? Obviously there's the physical rehab to it too, but how did it
Yeah.
affect you mentally in your sort of thought process coming into Ironman NZ this year?
Yeah, that specifically was, yeah, that happened, let's say Christmas Eve actually.
Oh
Um,
man.
and I had a race mid-Jan, which we were hoping to get some good prep for. So that was a bit of a speed bump in that prep. And that kind of came at the back end of a real rough 2023 for me, back end
Yeah.
of that, and I don't mean physically, I mean sort of mentally.
Mhm.
First year pro, the first half of the year went really well, and then from there downhill. I wouldn't say downhill, but I learned a lot in the back end of 2023, with a number of things going on, and then came home after a bit of travel end of last year. December was all lined up to race in Taupo in December, and got COVID sort of 10 days before. Couldn't race that, so that was
Man.
another kicker. And then, yeah, came out of that race going right. Taringa's on the cards now, and then came up with yeah, the intercostal strain, which particularly, I guess your question, going back to your question of how did that affect, I guess, my physiological state, or psychological
Mhm.
state,
Yeah, yeah,
through that time. And I guess where we positioned it was like I'd had quite a lot of, I wouldn't say trauma, but a lot going on, which was affecting my racing.
yeah,
So this was just another thing that came up, and it was kind of a make or break thing to go. We can stop training here, let the injury recover, and be good with it, and then come back.
mhm,
Or we can make a plan here to work with what we've got, but try and make the best out of the bad situation, if that makes sense, and
yeah,
still do my job essentially, because that's what it
mhm,
is.
yeah,
So we went for the latter option of that, and obviously there was a bit of planning involved. But yeah, from that state of processing that, it was just going, you know what, if I can get through this and prove to myself that actually this is not a big block, it's just something that I can work with, then it's another notch in the belt type thing. And
mhm,
it did prove to be that way. There was, I just had to look at this, what silver linings I could take from that injury. There were lots of, other aspects of gaining a lot of bike fitness. I was bound to the trainer for weeks on end,
yeah,
not being able to ride on the road, not being able to swim, and super limited on the running side of things, which ideally, if you look at it going into a race, was not ideal race prep.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but it was what it was, and actually turned out to have a okay race, and set up a real nice base for leading into this Ironman prep. So yeah,
Mhm. Man, kudos to you for pushing through that. I could only imagine how it must have felt like, I don't know, the last straw or something. When you're going through a tough slog, ah, shit, hit another barrier, and then like
yeah.
something else happens again. Like that must have taken a lot of, I don't know, mental toughness and like mental fortitude to push through it. What sounded like quite a pivotal moment too. It's almost like
Mm.
you. I'm not sure. Maybe this isn't how you viewed it, but it sounds like the way you articulated it. It's like if I choose to still continue, it's like you're choosing for the snowball to go that way and improve and still get better versus like, oh no, I'll put my foot on the brakes and like I'll just recover. It's almost like the snowball could have gone the other way where like, oh, I'll just continue to rest and continue to rehab and like not focus on getting better.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, you don't want that snowball to get too big. Like I guess I reflect on what has been my lowest point in the sport so far. And that came in November last year, um, in a half Ironman race in Melbourne actually, and I didn't finish, like I DNF'd. I got
Oh.
halfway through the bike and just the whole yeah, my head got to me and pulled out. And I actually remember saying, Mum was there. My mum came across for the race and she
Mhm.
was there supporting, and she copped all of it actually. I remember saying to
Oh,
her right
oh
after I
no.
pulled out and walked out of transition, I said, I'm not good enough for this sport anymore. I said, these guys are better than
Yeah.
me. And I said a whole bunch of words, but I said, this is too effing hard, this sport.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's definitely points, and I look back and I go, that was definitely my last point. There was a few things contributing to that.
Mhm.
But yeah, how I got out of that was with I got a really good support network around me, friends, family, coach, partner, mum, dad, and it was just making some really pivotal point decisions to go, actually, that's a moment. Um, I need to accept that, and if we try and ignore that, then that's probably not the right thing to do. We need to
Mhm.
acknowledge it and go, um, how can we make some changes that are going to prevent us getting here again? Because we don't want to get here again.
Yeah.
And we did. Like I came home. I've been away from home for a good period of time. Got back into some routine. Um, Found the enjoyment again in the sport, and I think we just pushed a little bit hard going into that race. And didn't wasn't not enjoying the sport, but just again created some aspects where I found um, the enjoyment in what I was doing.
Mm. Do you think having the ability to push through those kind of things and still have that mindset of seeking solutions and wanting to fix it and get better and extract the learnings from it is kind of helping you look ahead into the future and gonna help you through those tough moments again when they I don't know if it's inevitable, touch wood, but I feel like there's almost inevitable there'll be tough moments again. But do you think that kind of has made you more well equipped to tackle those situations?
Yeah, totally. And I'd say it definitely gives you resource and tools that you can
Mm,
use. But what I think it probably gives, if I'm talking from my perspective, um, it gives me the confidence to go, I got through that. Um, I'm now faced with this
mhm.
on a scale of, degree of how severe is this. Um, I can actually get through this, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
If that's not too confusing.
No, that's the power of data, man, and that's the power of like actually doing the thing, right? Like I've done the thing
Mm,
before, and I'm still here, and I got through it. Therefore, I have the data to back up my thinking that I have the ability to do it again.
100%. Yeah. Like
Yeah,
the scale of, at the moment, at that point in time, it feels like everything and anything, right?
yeah,
It's so massive. And then you look back today and you go, oh, yeah, well, at that point in time, it felt like everything. But relatively speaking, we've moved on. We're here. I've
yeah.
done this much between A and B, and look where we are now. So,
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah, when you approach friction in other kind of ways, maybe not on such a big scale. Let's think more like a really relatable one is having to do a training session that you don't want to do, which unless you're like a robot, I'm sure that probably happens reasonably frequently. How do you kind of talk to yourself into still doing that, and how do you approach those things when you don't want to do them?
Mm. Definitely occurs. Like there's a lot of days where you don't really want to get out the door, or the session is tough,
Yeah.
um, and it's like, well, the easy option is to not.
Hmm.
Um, but if you put your thought process, over the top of that session, let's say it's in a session, for example, how am I going to feel if I don't do that? You know,
Yeah.
um, there's some accountability, and I think I feel like I personally have high expectations and high standards of myself, and I've got to be accountable for what I do. So I want to go to bed every night knowing that I've given the best that I can in that particular day. And that doesn't necessarily mean the whole, no pain, no gain type thing. I have to hurt every day, but
Mm.
I need to know that I've given my best for that day and whatever that was. So I think just reminding yourself of what that is, even if there is that hard session, or even if it is not a super sunny day and it's miserable outside and you've still got to get outdoors. Yeah, it's an accountability thing, and
Mm-hmm.
knowing that actually there's a micro to everything, it's like that every session does count regardless of what it is. In the
Mm.
big scheme of things, that's kind of where I like to kind of put things in the
Yeah.
scheme of it. It's like this is contributing, and if I don't do it, then sure, I'll get away with it, and I can make up some excuse.
Mm.
Um, but being truthful and honest to what you actually want to achieve, like I want to be the best that I can be. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, just having that determination through that. But there's definitely days where it falls, and
Yeah.
not to say that you don't do what you need to, but making the start is the hardest thing. You just got to go actually by the end of it. Um, I should feel good by the end of it, and
Mm.
actually taking the time to go. If you do finish that session and you probably weren't that keen to start it, just taking 5 minutes to reflect on it and go, this is actually how I felt beforehand. Acknowledge and praise yourself that you did the session, you got through it, but just reminding yourself that that is a thing
Yeah.
before, and that's how you felt, and this is
Yeah.
where I am now, and I got it done.
I
Doesn't
love
mean
your
you need to live.
philosophy and how you're able to see the the sessions as being wins as well. I feel like it would
Mm,
be easy to focus on the race, the race is when I'm going to feel good because I'm going to have completed it. But it's like you're going to have a lot of sessions coming up to that race, and if you have that mindset like you're discussing there, I can see how like each session that you complete, like that's a win, like that's an accomplishment in itself.
yeah, and it's living. Yeah, as I say, it's living session by session. It's not really about, you know, sure, 4 weeks out, I am thinking about the race, or 6 weeks out, I am thinking about the race, but it's about what am I doing here at this point in time? And
Mm,
today, what have I got to do today in order to get to my goal, which is racing? And then tomorrow, what does tomorrow bring? It's the same with racing. Your windows of how far you look forward or into
yeah,
are definitely a thing. By the end of it, by 38K, you're probably in 30-second windows as to what can I do in the next 30 seconds to
mm,
to make that as good or as best of an athlete as I can. Whereas the first 2K on the bike, you're probably at like, right, what am I doing in the next half an hour? What have I got to do? So
yeah,
those
yeah,
windows
yeah.
get smaller and smaller. It's the same in training.
Ah, that's an interesting way of describing it because with this like mental toughness or facing into friction, I wanted to ask about it specifically when it comes to a race as well. Because no doubt there's tough times, if you come out of the water and you're further behind than you wanted to be, or you're on the bike and you're not in the position where you wanted to be. So explaining it in those windows makes a lot of sense. And are there what are some methods that you use specifically in the race
Mm.
to talk yourself around or like to keep your head in the game perhaps when like you're not in the position where you thought you would be?
Yeah. Ironman's amazing because it's a well, 8 to 9, 8+ hour race, right?
Yeah.
And something that's happening early on in the bike, which could only be 75 minutes into the race, you've still got so much time.
Mm.
Not to say that you need to dismiss any of that time, but if you're not potentially in a position where you want to be, there's still a lot that can happen in another 5 hours time. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
So
it's a lot of time to be on a bike, man.
yeah, and just going. it's a long day ahead yet. There's a lot of other people which you're not in control of their actions
Mm.
and what they're doing. Stick to what you need to, and some reassurance around that. There's quite a bit around the whole reframing the thoughts that are coming in, so there's a lot of data that is coming into the body of what you're observing, what you're feeling, whether that's positive or negative. More so, I'm talking about the negative stuff. The legs are sore, back sore. I'm breathing probably a little bit heavier, and it's just going, actually, how can I reframe that to create some positivity in my head, and use that as a bit of a win rather than a negative, because it's really easy for those thoughts to, like you say, snowball, and
Mm.
that just to become what you're constantly thinking about, other than executing what you need to at that point in time.
Yeah. Wow, that's a lot about mindfulness there. I like how you're talking about the thoughts coming into your head and actually being like an observer of them, as opposed to just like a thought comes in and then you just feel it straight away. Like you're taking an objective view on it and like assessing its sort of, I don't know, utility or something. And then if you can, like flipping it and turning it into more of like a positive, or maybe or at least a useful thing and not just a negative thing.
Yeah, and I think that's what training is for. You
Mm,
practice those things. You put yourself in some pretty gnarly situations in training where you're hurting pretty bad, and all you want to do is, what would relieve everything is to stop,
yeah.
right? And it's going, yep, that's all fine and well, but what can I do now to kind of reframe what I'm thinking, and not let that whole, my legs are burning, I've got some dreadful, I've got discomfort in my legs, and yeah, just taking that step back to go, not let those thoughts override.
I've heard sort of ultra runners sort of describing like running like 200 miles or something, and the question they ask is, can I take one more step? Yep, I can take one more step. Can I take one more step? Yep, I can take one more step. And then, not really before they knew it, but like eventually they crossed that 200-mile mark. Is it kind of like that in terms of how you chunk it down mentally too into those time frames?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I'm always a firm believer, and it's obviously pretty truthful, that the clock's always going to keep running. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? If you've got a 2 minute interval on the bike that you've got to do in training, like the clock will always keep going. It's just about how long you can with sustain the intensity or the duration, and just see out that window. So it's,
Yeah.
again, trying to narrow those windows down. We've got the race to do, and it's X amount of distances. They are what they are, but the clock will always keep going. And I guess a big win for us is like, well, the faster you go, the quicker it's over, type thing.
True. Yeah.
And just being efficient as you can. So all of that will pay dividends into you getting to the finish line faster, right?
Yeah, yeah, it makes sense, right? It sounds easy in theory, right?
Does, right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, zooming out a little bit and focusing more on the cardiovascular fitness and adaptations over time. You put this video up the other day, and it kind of blew my mind a little bit. I mean, I'm not like a top tier athlete or anything, but I've been getting into running, so I understand a bit about like pacing and heart rate, and I've been tracking those for myself. And I'm not fast or fit, but you put this video up the other day, and you did I wrote it down. You did a 35K run with a 500-meter elevation gain. Your average pace was 418, and then your average heart rate was 149. And it just like, I don't know, it just blew my mind. I don't know, maybe for you that's just like a standard run, but and it was like half of that was in zone two as well. So from like, it's obviously going to be hard to articulate exactly how you got so fit, but are there any sort of broad brush strategies or approaches that you've taken over time to build such a high level of cardiovascular fitness?
Yeah, definitely is. And intentionally, it's like that. It is working that aerobic, whatever you want to call it, aerobic zone two,
Yeah.
lower end, lower end intensity, and just spending a lot of time in that zone, rather than, the hard hit outs of trying to run your fastest 1K for multiple reps every single session. I mean,
Yeah.
there's like a lot of satisfaction that comes from that, and
Yeah.
it looks awesome on Strava and
Yeah, I
blah
was
blah
gonna say
blah.
the
But
Strava stats.
yeah, I think there's a lot to be taken into account for just easy training, and
Mm,
it's a hard one to comprehend because your ego gets like put in a paper bag pretty quickly, or it needs
yeah.
to anyway.
Yeah.
And like you say, your splits and your data that you display is nothing fantastic.
Hmm.
So I think in the early days for me, it was a lot of that zone two kind of work
Yeah.
and spending a lot of time there on both the bike and the run. And like there's ways that you can make it really enjoyable rather than just going out and running, for me, like 130 heart rate, which would probably be a true zone two for me, and
Yeah.
ticking through it like whatever Ks, because that's pretty boring. There's ways you can make it fun. You can jump on a hike with friends and run walk, and just be bound a little bit by heart rate,
Yeah.
and go on like a long hike mission or mountain biking, just keeping your heart rate nice and low. So there's definitely different ways to do it rather than just slogging out easy Ks on the road and laps and laps. But yeah, definitely, I think sprinkling of that higher intensity stuff in
Yeah.
is still needs to happen. But it's not the typical how society perceives it of like, I guess if I reflect what I used to do in CrossFit is turn up every day and you just you just smack it
100%
and
every
give it.
day.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and you give it. And you're probably a little bit younger and whatnot. Take that tolerance, take that load, take that inflammation. But I think if we're looking at longevity and sustainability through increase of that cardiovascular system and what's good for us too in terms of creating inflammation,
Mm.
it's yeah, it's that low intensity zone two aerobic work.
Yeah, and that's that stuff like at least someone like me who's not super fit, like running is just it's so hard to tap into my zone too. Because even if I'm running like real slow, like 5:30 to 6 minute Ks, and I feel like I'm running slow, I got a Garmin as well. It's just always like high aerobic. My heart rate's in like the 150s. I'm like, man, but what I've found, and it's interesting you mentioned cycling, it seems like cycling, at least from my short amount of experience, seems to be like an easier way to stay in that zone two kind of space because you're not trying to like walk run or something. You can just spin your legs slower or like lower down the intensity or something if you're on an indoor bike.
Yeah. I mean, there's clear discrepancy between, like swimming or perceived effort of swimming, biking, and running, and where the
Yeah.
zones fall in terms of how much you feel you're putting out in the different sports.
Mm.
And the running's a hard one because we're dealing with terrain as well. You go up a
Yeah.
hill or up a little incline, and all of a sudden the heart rate's up by 10, 15 beats, and you're going,
Yeah.
oh, hold on, I'm at threshold heart rate here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Walk.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But having the ability to be able to control yourself to do that is definitely a thing as well. So,
Hmm.
yeah.
And now that you're at the level that you're at, what does making improvements look like for you? You know, making improvements for someone like me who runs 15 to 20K in a week, maybe like
Mm.
improvements is it's obvious, just keep doing it, slowly progress it, blah, blah, blah. But when you're at your level, like getting towards the top of the sport, how do you improve and what does improving look like to you?
Yeah, I think that there's probably two ways to look at that, or two ways that we look at it. The first is what potential do I still have to make as an athlete myself, and
Hmm.
that falls in the probably the performance aspect, and always wanting to be faster and fitter and better. But then there's also the other aspect of what's happening around you, because we're racing against other people and the demands of what's happening in the field, and how can you train to be able to race and meet those demands of what's happening against your competitors. So there's two different things going on there. I think as you get deeper in any sport, the potential performance gaps get smaller.
Yeah.
Like you make big progress early on, and
Hmm.
then the more time you spend in the sport, the more intricate and detailed you have to be about where your performance improvements
Yeah.
are. So for me, like I guess if I look back on my first Ironman that I did compared to now, what am I doing different? It's not really about the duration and the time, the accumulative time, because that was once a thing. I'm training a lot differently now. I'm probably doing a lot more at race pace
Yeah.
these days. Whereas early on, it was about being able to just sustain the time that I needed to out there and be able to bike 180k and then be able to run a marathon off that. So,
Mm.
which the body had never done before. Now
Yeah.
we've got a little bit of that in the bank. It's about, right, how can we be faster at those and breaking each of those down. There's things like gear, there's aerodynamics, there's improvements there, and we're constantly making changes around all of that. But I mean, your overall fitness, you obviously want to be trending up across not just session by session, but races by races, year by year, and from when I first started to now, there obviously wants to be that incline in the overall fitness, which
Yeah.
naturally is going to come if you're doing it the right way.
And what's your perspective on sort of nature versus nurture and the genetic component of your cardiovascular ceiling? Like obviously if you're born with a large heart and big lungs and stuff, you've already genetically predisposed to have a bigger engine. So what's your perspective on it? Do you think that, like, I don't know if I want to say anyone, but the vast majority of people have the ability to get super fit and compete in an Ironman at the level that you are?
I think so. Like I honestly, truly believe that it's just a matter of starting. To be
Mm.
honest, it's a matter
Yeah.
of starting, and once you start, then you've got a stake in the ground, and whether you just want to get to the finish line, or whether you want to be a top sort of age group athlete, elite level age group athlete, podium, or whether you are a professional racing. I think it's all relative, and the scale sits within the individual. But
Yeah.
I think it's about making a start for anyone really,
Mm.
and progressing on that, because that's exactly what I did. You to look at some of these pros, and they've been in the sport for 20 years, 20 plus years, which is amazing. Credit to them.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like, I compare myself there and go, I've been in the sport less than half of the time of you. Um, yep, they may have a whole bunch of stuff on me, but I'm still aspiring to be as good as them, or as close as I can get to them.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. And I'm sure you wouldn't still be pursuing such a high intensity sport if you didn't have that mindset, right? Like you're not just there to have fun and go for a swim in a lake and go for a little bike ride,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
And
again, it comes back to that kind of personal accountability factor.
yeah,
Yeah.
when it comes to the people that you train, because you're kind of mentioning people just starting out there, what are some of the in your experience, what are some of the things that people get wrong when they first start, or maybe yeah, just do incorrectly in their training, or maybe the misconceptions that they have, what do they do wrong when they first start out?
Yeah, it's a good point. Well, you get one or two. You get the one that just wants to, I guess, have everything in terms of gear as
Oh
well. Like,
yeah, man.
that's a
I need the
classic,
specialized bike with the carbon frame and the
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
which is definitely a thing, and there's a time and a place for all of that. But there's also, like I started out on a wind trainer that was not what I've got these days. And
Yeah.
my coach would never have been able to convince me at that point of time to go and spend $1,500 on a direct drive wind trainer. It just wasn't going to happen.
Yeah.
So I think that there's an element of time that people need to spend starting in order
Yeah.
to progress.
Yeah.
Like, it took me many months on that particular wind trainer before going, actually, I'm now at this point, I see what this next step up in the gear could do.
Hmm.
I'm now ready to make that, rather than just laying out whatever you lay out and go and spending $1,500 on this one train and not having too much. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
probably going to help, but I think it's part of the process and part of the journey. So, yeah, just initially having a little bit of time in the sport, and like I love seeing people have those early wins early on when they're fresh
yeah,
into things.
yeah,
And it's just like that satisfaction of them seeing their own achievement and success, and it's relative to them.
yeah,
It could just be that they actually are now running the distance of 5 kilometers,
yeah,
whereas before they couldn't even make a K.
yeah.
That is definitely a thing. So it's again relative to the individual, but it's I guess those initial wins are pretty high for a lot of people.
Yeah, that wanting to get all the best gear, but you have no idea kind of thing is so relatable, man. And I would describe it as like do the thing and then buy the next thing that's going to fix a problem that you encounter, right? If why would you spend three times more on that trainer when this trainer is perfectly suitable for you? But it's I don't know if it's a social media thing or whatever, but like if you always see like the people with the best stuff, it's
Yeah.
so easy to think that you also need the best stuff. But like the cheapest one off Trade Me is probably going to be absolutely fine for you right now.
Yeah,
And
for the time and the place of where they are in the sport, it'll do for even if it's like 2 weeks
yeah,
until you get to the next stage of performance,
yeah.
then we can talk about whatever that looks like next.
Yeah, and one thing that I encountered when I started running again, I used to do a decent amount of running and then stopped because the gym was way better than running. And then I thought I should probably start running again. One thing that I noticed is that I definitely did too much too soon. So when it comes to managing the training load, particularly for people starting out, do you have a rough framework or approach to that in terms of a gradual progressive overload?
Yeah, I think, speaking from that perspective, it's everything you're doing has or should, doesn't have to, but should have some element of progression in it.
Hmm.
And whether you look at that progression to be session by session, week by week, month by month, as to where you want to go with what you're doing, should be, holistic in that respect. Um, if the goal is to go and run your local 5K park run, how do you do that appropriately when you haven't done too much running, where you're not going to go and try and bang out a 10K run in the first week, right? It's
Yeah,
incremental. And it's the same philosophy that I talk to with this whole low carb approach. I can comfortably go out and ride 6.5 hours fasted, no fuel, electrolytes in, that's cool. But there was a point in time where I started and I couldn't ride for an hour without having to consume some element of fuel.
yeah.
So it was about building up to that, and it didn't just happen over the course of a week or 2 weeks. It took time.
Mhm.
Once I got that 1 hour on the bike fasted, then I'd push it out to 90 minutes, and I'd push it out to 2 hours. And over time, I've got to that 6.5 hour window where I can do that comfortably, and that's
Uh,
just the norm for me now. But there
yeah,
was a point in time where I couldn't do that, so I think that kind of falls into the same bracket as yeah, what's relative. Things have got to be in a progressional state, and looking at where you want to go, how you want to get there is the major consideration.
yeah, and just taking that logical approach, like you say, it's so easy just to, especially if you've maybe done a bit of sport or like maybe you're competitively inclined or something, to start running and be like, nah, I'm running 10K today because I'm started running again. I bought my new shoes, my new Adidas, whatever
Yeah,
they are, and I'm going for a run, and then you pull a hamstring or you strain your calf or something, and then you're out for 6 weeks. And it's so interesting how that is applied like in this sense, but also like in strength training when it comes to nutrition, if you're wanting to bulk up or cut down or whatever, it's like a seems to be a common like approach where it's like a take a gradual progressive overload approach that's subjective to you as an individual. There's no like cookie cutter plan per se that's like, here's your half marathon plan, go from 0 Ks to running a half marathon.
yeah,
But like there isn't like a plan that's going to be perfect for everyone, right?
No, 100%. And I think that highlights the importance of having a second set of eyes, or having a coach, having a mentor, having someone that's advising you a
Yeah,
little bit there, because you can get super um, yeah, as the athlete, it's like, yep, I've banked 2 weeks of running and I'm getting to this half marathon. I reckon I can just bust it out this week, you know?
yeah, mate.
But
Yeah.
you talk to your coach, or you talk to your mentor, or whoever you're
Mm,
working with, and they go, oh, no, hold on, that's probably not going to end that well for you.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, so I think that kind of highlights the fact and the need in most cases, to have someone working along, to have someone that you work alongside with.
yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. And before we wrap up, I want to just ask you about your upcoming plans for this year. So obviously, the most pressing one is next weekend, a week away. But what does the rest of your year look like? Have you planned it out and kind of have a rough idea of what you want to do?
To some degree, I do, but also it's a little bit. I wouldn't say race by race, but just taking things as they come. There's a lot
Mm,
of things that just pop up and occur that I've learned
yeah,
across the time in the sport, and you can have this amazing plan of, I'm going to go and race all of these races, book some travel, get all that stuff done, and something might flip that upside down pretty quickly. So I guess for me, yeah, it's racing next weekend. Ironman New Zealand, and then beyond from that, we'll probably go and race Ironman Cairns.
yeah,
That's in June. Um, I mean, getting a Kona slot for me this year that would be amazing if I could do that.
hmm
And I need to qualify for that. So I guess giving myself the opportunity to do that Ironman New Zealand, Ironman Cairns is a thing. If it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. But that would be, I guess, something that I want. Beyond that, not quite sure in terms of racing. I usually go and base myself in Australia for most of the New Zealand winter,
yeah,
which I say that probably will be a thing again this year,
hmm
and we'll do that. So yeah, we'll get through next weekend, and then I think after that we'll be able to make some decisions around racing, and where we're going for the rest of the year. But it'll certainly be kind of outside New Zealand
yeah.
through the winter period, and definitely based in Australia.
Oh man, that's the way to do it. I think you got it sussed, to be honest. And if people want to follow your journey and see what you're up to, where is the best place for people to find you?
Yeah, on Instagram. I guess that's the pretty big platform for most.
Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, that's pretty much where everything goes. I do a coaching on the side, not that that's an advertisement platform, but MK Performance. So I've got a good crew there, nice little community
Mhm.
of athletes, and a good bunch racing next weekend as well. So yeah, looking forward to it.
Epic, man. Oh well, thanks heaps. I appreciate your time.
Awesome, mate. Thanks for having me.